Hello, and welcome back to Seek the Joy podcast. Happy Seek the Joy Tuesday. I'm your host, Sydney Weiss, and happy almost last episode of 2020. It is our 2020 recap episode, and I'm excited to dive in and talk about and share and reflect on the last year of both our lives and the podcast. I think to say that 2020 has been a bit of a bumpy ride is probably an understatement, and I'm still honestly not totally sure how I feel about this year. But if there's one thing that I know for sure about 2020 is that it's been a year that really taught me so much about patience. It's a year that really asked me, and I'm curious if this has been your experience too. It's been a year that has asked me to take a deep breath and to try and practice trust and have this trust in knowing that ultimately everything will be okay. But to really trust in my own ability, I think too, and our ability together to keep moving forward. I think this year too also really asked me to trust my definition of joy and to trust my own definition of success and what I can really handle. There's a lot of noise, and we talk about it often on the podcast about ideas of what we should be doing or not doing, how many new hobbies we should have been picking up in this pandemic, how we define the way in which we're successful. But I think what has been the most important thing is to develop your own definition of your joy and success and your bandwidth and everything else in between, and to stick to that definition as much as possible. This year too has brought a lot of loss. It's brought a lot of loss for me personally. I think it's brought a lot of loss for you too. I haven't talked about this yet on the podcast, but 2 months ago to the day in which this podcast will be released, I lost my grandpa. And in a year that has left so many of us, including me, really isolated and overwhelmed and trying to find new ways to connect digitally, and it's been tough. So in a year that has already had so much loss in so many ways for so many of us, this personal loss for me is still, it's very difficult. I'm trying not to cry, but it's very difficult. Grief, I think, is universal in 2020. And we're all experiencing this sense of grief and loss in our own way. And I'm learning that there is so much that we learn, gain, experience as a result of grief. And I think that this pandemic and this year 2020 has led to, I think I've said this a million times already in the last 3 minutes, but it's led to this collective feeling of loss. We've had a loss of sense of normalcy. We've had a loss of sense of our day-to-day routine, of our connections with others. So many people have lost their jobs and have gotten sick and everything else in between. And so 9 months later, I think we're still adjusting to this new sense of normal. But what I'm learning about grief, and I hope to expand more and talk more about this in 2021, I'm learning that grief expands us because it allows us to be more empathetic, to relate to the pain and loss that somebody else is experiencing. And I think in many ways, that's why 2020 feels like a year of greater compassion and understanding, a greater year of honesty and truth-telling, of coming together, of being connected in a way that I don't think we've experienced previously. Because in many ways right now, if you think about it, we're all connected in a way that we've never been before. We're connected by this sense of loss and this sense of grief. And I think too that 2020 has been this year of seeing the humanity in others. We're connected now more than ever by our shared humanity. And I honestly hope that this sense of connection and understanding of compassion and truth-telling and honesty, I hope that that's a trend that continues in 2021 and beyond. I'm really good with leaving the virus and the pandemic behind us, even though I think we have a ways to go, but I hope that we bring that sense of compassion and kindness with us moving forward. As you can tell, I've been spending a lot of time reflecting on 2020, and I think it's also been a tremendous year of listening, because in a year where we all want to be part of meaningful change, in a year where we all want to better ourselves through that change and through gaining a better understanding, we've also had to understand our role in that change. And I was first reminded of this during the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it must have been at the beginning of the summer, and really recognizing my role as a listener. And that was further solidified, and I was further reminded of that when I sat down with Kristen Brandt, author of Impact and co-founder of She's the First, a couple of weeks ago. She really reminded me too of just how important it is to be a listener and recognize your role in social change. And if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I highly recommend going back and tuning in, because it's a powerful conversation. I'm really excited and grateful to spend the next however many minutes reflecting on the last year, and I hope that this episode inspires you to spend a little bit of time reflecting on 2020 for you too. So let's kick this off by talking a little bit about the highlights for Seek the Joy over the last year. In October, we celebrated 3 years of the podcast, which I say this every year, but it's definitely a milestone that I never imagined hitting. It's like you work on something and you continue to share it and you're having so much fun, and the next thing you know, another year has gone by. So it was fun to celebrate 3 years of the podcast in October. We grew in countries all over the world this year, and I've had the incredible opportunity to continue to share my journey and the journey of the podcast on different platforms and podcasts, including speaking at Podbean's Podcast Wellness Week last week. And I've heard from so many of you this year than ever before, and I'm so grateful. I think the biggest highlight that has to be just the constant connection with all of you in the conversation, and the ability to share these episodes and to continue to build this community together. So thank you, really, as always, for being here. So let's start at the beginning of 2020. So in February, we launched a brand new series on the podcast called Lessons In, and I'm so happy that I launched this series because the response has been so wonderful and it's been so much fun to share. The focus of the series is really on life's biggest lessons, and it explores the joys that we can find through these experiences and through our connections, and the community that we can really inspire and create through sharing our reflections. And by the end of this year, we'll have shared 15 episodes in this new series, and I'm really happy and excited for it to continue because the lessons have been really beautiful. I mean, from lessons in self-worth to boundaries to energy healing and resilience and remaining flexible. Every episode and conversation has personally left me feeling really inspired and motivated, and I hope that it's had the same impact on you too. It's funny, February, like reflecting on February feels like so long ago, because February and the beginning of March was like still kind of business as usual, both for the podcast, but also in our world. And then the pandemic hit here in the United States and pretty much everywhere else. And I remember coming home, I think it must have been like Thursday, March 12th. And I didn't know like when we would go back to the office, and I had this like huge box with me of like my files, but I more than carrying like those files and the paperwork home in order to do my job from home, what I carried with me the most was this sense of uncertainty and this sense of fear and anxiety and overwhelm. And the more that we all connected on Instagram and Facebook in that time, I know that you felt it too. And so March, I don't know, in many ways feels like a time where we were just trying to continue like some sense of normalcy. And I continued to work on the podcast and at my full-time job. And then April came around and I had this idea. That it was time to move the power of storytelling over to its own podcast. And I don't know if I did a great job, quite frankly, at sharing that news with all of you. But if you don't know, the series The Power of Storytelling has been something I have loved sharing on this podcast and this platform over the last 3 years. And the response has been phenomenal, both from people who have shared their story to listeners around the world who found inspiration in a story and then wanted to share theirs as well. And so I thought, okay, it's definitely time to move this series over to its own podcast. So in May, I launched Stories of Inspiring Joy, which is our sister podcast that goes live. There's a new episode that goes live twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. And you'll hear some familiar stories as well as tons and tons of new stories. And I'm so excited to continue to share your reflections and your words and this community over on our sister podcast. So you can find all episodes of Stories of Inspiring Joy on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you like the show, please hit subscribe and leave a rating and review. It's still sort of gaining its legs in a lot of ways, but kicking off at the same time. And I love it. I think now more than ever, we really need these stories. We need your stories and moments, I think, that will continue to bring us together in community and really remind us that we're never alone in what we're experiencing, even when we feel so far apart. So I'm excited to continue sharing these stories over on Stories of Inspiring Joy. So the summer, by the way, just flew by. I don't know if it flew by for you, but it flew by for me. And it wasn't short of incredible conversations, though, from John Clarence Stewart to Kelly Rutherford. I don't know, August might just be my favorite month on Seek the Joy. And then, of course, in October, we celebrated 3 years of the podcast, and I really loved spending some time in reflection in that solo episode, just talking about the last 3 years and my biggest takeaways and why it's so important to continue to celebrate ourselves. I honestly can't, though, get over the conversations we had on the podcast this year. Our first episode of 2020, I think it was in like the first week of February, was with Reina Noriega, and she's a beautiful, incredible visual artist and photographer, educator, and writer. And I think that episode completely set the tone for this year. We had incredible conversations this year with entrepreneurs like Olivia Herrick and Logan Sneed and Liesel Ulrich Verderber and Audrey Ori. We had, oh my gosh, powerful conversations about wellness and healing with Katie DePaula and Katie Calder, Amanda and Christopher Dahl, Amy White, and Liliana Barzola. We had empowering conversations about mental health with Asha Terry and Akia Red and Lisa Poe, and just honestly transformative conversations with John Clarence Stewart and Kelly Rutherford and Kristen Brandt. Honestly, just to name a few. It blows me away that I have the opportunity to continue to share and have these conversations. And thank you as always for tuning in. And I would love to hear what's been your favorite episode this year. I can't pick a favorite because I feel like that would, if I had children, that would be like trying to pick my favorite child, and that's just not fair. But there are some really good ones in last year in 2020, and I'd love to know what was your standout episode. I know I've touched on this a little bit, but it's no secret that every aspect of our lives this year has been affected by the pandemic and the struggle for racial justice and the 2020 election and honestly everything else in between. And that's just touching and talking about things that happened on the world stage and doesn't even take into account what's been going on in your personal life and in your inner circle. And my conversation this year with Audrey Ori, and she's an incredible author and ghostwriter, publisher. I mean, that's an episode you absolutely have to listen to. But my conversation with Audrey really reminded me of the power in writing our own narrative and how, especially in this year, in 2020, it is so important that we document our own experiences. Because when we do that, when we take the time to document how we feel and what we're experiencing and how it's experiencing our friends and our family and our community, we're taking, I think at the one hand, we're taking ownership of our own experience, which is so huge and so important, but it's also taking your own power back. And so I wanted to share both some questions and reflections for 2020, but also for 2021 and the year ahead, in the hopes that these questions or just prompts will help and inspire you as well, because there is so much power in just taking some time to reflect on our experiences. And I'm going to include everything in the show notes for today's episode. So if you missed one of the questions or reflections, they are at the link in the show notes. It'll take you to the website, and you can find all the questions and reflections there. But the first one is, how has this year challenged and changed you? How will you remember this time in your life? How can you begin to document this time for yourself, whether it's through journaling, voice notes, Instagram posts, or music? Find a way that works for you to document and then reflect and look back on this time. The next one really comes and stems from a conversation I had on the podcast with Amy White, and Amy is an intuitive and medium. And if you listen to that episode, she talked a lot about how there are gifts to be found in this moment, in this global pause, and that ultimately we get to choose the impact that this time has on us. And I thought that sentiment and what Amy shared in that episode was incredibly empowering, because we can either let this time define us or we can allow it to transform us. And so the reflection kind of prompt that came from this for me was, what gift or gifts has 2020 brought you? And how can you let those gifts transform you rather than letting this time define you? The next one is, how has this year changed your perspective? What is one thing that you want to do, be, feel, or experience in 2021? This last one might be my personal favorite, but if you could pick a word for 2020, what would it be? And then if you could pick a word for 2021, a word that captures how you want to feel and what it is that you want to experience next year and what you want to share with the world, what would that be? But ultimately, I think whenever you're spending some time in reflection or thinking about the year ahead, it's always important to remember that it's okay to not know what's next. And it's really okay to not have a plan. I think 2020 has been a year that has shown us that it's good to have a plan, but it's also good to stay flexible within that. But ultimately, always keep dreaming and always keep allowing yourself the space to continue your vision and think bigger and dream bigger. And I think that's what I'm most excited for 2021 is an opportunity to just continue moving forward and keep dreaming big and thinking big and allowing, myself and the podcast to step into whatever is next. And thinking about what's next actually makes me very excited, because I've been thinking a lot about the direction of Seek the Joy and the platform and stories of inspiring joy and everything else in between in 2021. But I keep coming back to just the importance of sharing both the joy and the loss, because I plan to continue to share empowering and powerful conversations and conversations that inspire us and empower us, but also challenge us and remind us of our joy and remind us of our shared humanity. And I keep really coming back to something that I felt all along, which is just how important it is to cultivate and be part of a really intentional media space, because it's an honor that you're hitting play on this podcast and that you're choosing to spend time with me and whoever is hopping on the microphone with me. And I just have been thinking so much this year about our role, my role, the podcast role in storytelling and shaping conversations and in supporting our communities. And I think the ability, I say this all the time, but I think the ability to harness the power of storytelling and build connections as a result and open ourselves up to new ideas is truly the power of podcasting. But beyond that, it is truly the power of the Seek the Joy community. And so what I know for sure is that we can't come together as a community. We can't reflect and celebrate our shared humanity if we can't explore our joys and passions, but then also explore grief and loss and hardship and adversity. And I think if we can begin to hold both at the same time, we will grow in ways that we never expected, but it will grow in ways that are transformative and powerful. because we can hold that joy and we can hold that inspiration and that passion and that hope in one hand, and then grief, frustration, anger, loss, disappointment in the other. So get ready and get excited, because in 2021, we're just going to continue to have real and authentic, honest conversations. We're going to talk about our joy and moments of inspiration, but we're also going to talk about what's really happening in the world and how we can continue to respond to it and stay true to ourselves through it, because it's really through these conversations that we'll find greater joy and explore our joy's impact and our impact and talk about real change, and while still really providing a space of joy and empowerment and inspiration. So I'm excited. I hope you're excited too, because if 2020 has shown me anything, it's that we can totally learn and grow together through these powerful and honest and impactful conversations, because joy does exist at the same time as every other emotion. We have the choice, I think, to step into it and harness it and embody it. And I'm really excited to continue this journey, and I'm excited to honestly just continue this journey with you. So, on a programming note, we won't be airing any new episodes for the last 2 weeks of December, but we have a brand new episode next week. It's our final Lessons In episode for 2020. And then don't forget, we have so many other places where you can find inspiration and read about and listen to incredible people, from Joy Corner, which is the blog series on our website, to Stories of Inspiring Joy. There is honestly so much good stuff and so much inspiration and so many people to explore. I'll also say, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter to stay in the loop on all things Seek the Joy. I share joyful moments of the week and what's happening kind of behind the scenes, and it's a really great place to stay connected. And I will include a link to subscribe to the newsletter in the show notes for today's episode. So I'll still be around. I'll still be here, even though we won't be airing any new episodes for the final 2 weeks of 2020. I've decided I've got to try, emphasis on try, to unplug and relax and just work on some things behind the scenes. But I would love it if you would come hang out with me, come hang out with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We are at Seek the Joy Podcast everywhere. If you're on Apple Podcasts, hit subscribe. If you're on Spotify, hit follow and leave us a rating and review. You guys know just how important those reviews are, and I'm really grateful for all of them. All right, that's it. This is our 2020 year in review. It's our 2020 recap. I hope that this episode has, encouraged you to reflect on your last year. I think, what a year. And I said this at the very beginning, I still don't totally know what I think about 2020, but it has provided a lot of lessons and opportunities, but also a lot of loss and a lot of hardship for myself, but also for so many. So just sending you all a big hug and so much love. And thank you as always. And thank you again for being here, for listening, for hitting play on the podcast, for sharing it with your communities, whether online or with your friends in your group chats. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm just wishing you and your family and your friends a very happy and healthy and safe holiday season. We'll see you right back here next week for our final episode of 2020. And then make sure to come back January 5th for a brand new episode. So be well, stay safe. I've been ending every email this year with stay safe, stay healthy, but really, please stay healthy and safe, and do something this holiday season that fills you up and brings you joy. And until we get to chat again, have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll talk soon. I'm really glad I did this. This was fun to record. All right, bye guys.